Companies and organizations around the world may have the best intentions in mind when they're designing climate action solutions. Yet many do not achieve their desired outcomes and human behavior remains unchanged. The next panel will discuss why this is the case and bring real-life examples on how climate solutions should be designed. So I'm really glad to welcome the next moderator, Shinichi Nikuni, on the stage. He's the managing partner and co-founder of Nordic Ninja. And with him, Annu Nieminen and Lisett Luik. Please, a round of applause.
So, yeah, it's so much excited to have. This is the third time Latitude59. I'm happy to moderate this fantastic founders. I'm Shin, partner of Nordic Ninja Venture Capital. It's basically early stage venture capital. I'm based in Helsinki, originally from Japan, but happy to welcome Annu and Lisett here. So maybe we can start a quick introduction with the founders side first. Maybe you can cover yourself and also your company, your solution, integrating what you do, what's your client, customers. Then we can work on furthermore on this, what kind of incentives we have to discuss and what we have to deep dive further. But maybe, Annu, can you start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you in beautiful Tallinn today. So my name is Annu. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Upright. We are a Helsinki-based company of a bit more than 40 people right now, building a new type of a quantification model to measure what we call the net impact of companies. This is really initiated by my frustration, or maybe put it like a passion, to really bring the same kind of rigor and comparability that we are used to seeing in financial data to impact data. So what we're really doing is shortly put, drawing on open science, taking usage of what humanity already knows and has put together in terms of information, and modeling that towards the real-life products and services that can currently be traded in the global markets. And of course, using them, then building profiles and impact quantifications for companies, and by using them to derive the funds and portfolios. We currently work with a bit more than 200 institutional investors, ranging from asset owners, asset managers, PE, VC, but also corporations, especially the larger ones that are facing now increasing regulations to scientifically and quantitatively measure their impact. And maybe even more than that, our passion is really to make this information truly something that is not just hidden in the back rooms of big fancy financial institutions and something that only a very chosen few people can have a look at in a secret terminal, but rather really bring this something that is transparent and everyone can use. So the main vehicle through which we are now making this data available is a open access platform that is available for anyone to use, and we now have about 10,000 company profiles for anyone to see at uprightplatform.com if you're interested in seeing that. But really look forward to this very interesting discussion about incentives and how to move from great intentions to actual incentives, and also look forward to hearing from my fellow panelist, Lisett.
Yeah, Lisett, please continue. Thank you. Thank you, Annu.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here as well and discussing this, to me, very exciting topic, but then I might be a uniquely nerdy person on this topic. So I'm the co-founder of Arbonics. Arbonics helps landowners plant more forests, and we do that by precisely providing them with incentives that would create the sort of behavior we want to see in the form of carbon credits. So I clearly have a lot of thoughts on incentives, positive, negative incentives, financial, otherwise. Ready to dig into that.
Thank you. I think you mentioned a very interesting point. positive incentives or negative incentive or even like a punishment, something like that. Maybe could you elaborate a bit on how you can address, because those incentives works quite differently, especially for if you consider the human emotion, the human mind, how it behaves. It's quite different to the positive one, negative one. Maybe could you a bit elaborate more on that? Maybe.
Yeah, I find that quite a helpful way to think about it, because I think especially in the climate space, so much of stuff historically is done through like what I would term as negative incentives, fear, threatening people, punishing people. And I think that works to a limit, but not maybe all the way. And so that's where positive incentives come in. And positive incentive is basically where you would get somehow rewarded for doing a good behavior. So that could be financial, but it could also be rewarded with good press, more talent applying to your company, your investors being happier with you, etc. And I think the reason it's helpful to think in that, really differentiate between those two types of incentives is it comes to kind of core psychology. So if you think about, if you've ever had to train a dog, you probably thought about training them with treats or training them by yelling at it. And in my personal experience, treats work like 10 times as efficiently as yelling at someone. And so I think the same philosophy carries on to humans. We might like to think we're immensely more complex, but fundamentally we operate on the same principles. And so I'm a big believer in that if we want to see really large-scale change, we need to have positive incentives as well as the deterrents as well.
Yeah, fully agree. And as a kind of investor side, we have also incentives, and some we have to do something because we are kind of forced in a sense. But yeah, also I'm also investing in the health tech area. That you need some punishment, but you also need a positive incentive so that people can, for example, taking medicines for years and years. It is a bit boring thing that people can easily forget about. Okay, let's forget about, no worries. But this has an impact. So, but maybe also how this Upright Impact platform, how does it work to give positive and or negative incentive to the especially companies and maybe the asset owners?
Yeah, I think the whole discussion around incentives when it comes to impact is a very crucial one, and I guess even more timely one now than it was a couple of years ago, mainly because the talk around impact is everywhere. It's now easier to find a VC that is trying to differentiate with impact than one that is not talking about impact at all, while the definitions are still really wild, and the actual incentives to act in a bolder way are not necessarily there. I really like, Lisett, what you said about the sticks and the carrots, and I think we are still lacking in both in many ways when you think of the actual real-life situation of a VC or a corporation deciding on what kind of climate action or sustainability actions to take. When it comes to Upright, to your question, our whole company is built on the idea that the humanity, we can't afford to wait, and the planet, unfortunately, does not afford to wait for everybody to somehow morally get on a higher ground. I don't believe we are in this mess because people morally somehow want to destroy the planet or our species, but it is because of the concrete incentives. What really moves the capitalistic system is making money, and we need to understand how money moves and what really drives and what are the people that in the end of the day dictate how money moves in the world. And for companies in the capitalistic system, it's actually really simple. It is stakeholders that every company needs to please very easily. There is no company in this world that can afford to not care about whether they are attracting their customers, whether in B2B it's companies or B2C it's consumers. Similarly, almost all the companies need to, at some point at least, attract investors, so some kind of capital to make it possible what they do. And at least to my knowledge, there are not yet quite any large-scale companies that are completely run by an AI, so they need to attract at least some employees as well. So this forms really the incentive mechanisms. Where do investors want to invest in? Where do customers want to buy from? Where do employees want to work for? And I am nerdy enough, and I guess idealistic enough to think that this information and this decision-making that is currently happening by whether it's you and me in the grocery store or many of you as professional investors when you're making investment decisions or maybe executive in a company, that we would all rather make good than bad decisions. And what needs to happen is for us to have better transparency to the actual real-life impacts, and to have that information widely enough available so that it creates these mass-scale incentives. So that as an LP, for example, you are both financially and impact-wise incentivized to care about where your money is actually being invested.
By the way, LP is a limited partner. This is basically some investors backing normal VCs, like a fund manager like us. So then, but also this is covering very interesting point, actually. I think that I understand both your clients, your customers, are basically corporate organization, basically, in a sense, because individual incentives might not actually straightforwardly working for in some organization because there's some like a decision-making processes in the organization. It's slightly different to just purchasing some goods at retail stores or something. So I just wonder maybe how you can address the changes of this, changes of the decision-making process in a sense, and how do you see it? Is it so different from the individual decision-making, or how do you see on the difference between the individual decision-making and this kind of corporate decision-making in terms of this, how they on these climate actions?
Well, to my experience, it's not that different, really. When it comes to an individual who is using like 14 hours a day to, I don't know, raise a fund and to really use their life in a meaningful way, they really, I've yet to meet a person who would rather spend their time on something that was net negative than net positive. Then it all becomes to how the game really works. So you need to have, in order for the positive impact to make sense, for example, for a venture capital investor, of course, need to make sense for their LPs, and it needs to be in their best interest towards their LPs. Then in corporations or in companies in general, it all boils down to what their customers are asking for. What is either the positive, the stick, or the carrot from the customer side that is forcing them to act? It can be some stick format, like, let's say, they have been getting some bad rep when it comes to climate or diversity or something like that, which is forcing the company or the executives to act. Or it can be more on the carrot side, like Lisett was bringing up, of seeing that, hey, this is actually great for us to communicate what we're doing and be seen in a better light. But I'd actually like to hear, I guess you know a lot about the carrot side as well.
Yeah, so what we do is we focus a lot on financial incentives, so we essentially pay landowners in carbon credits to do the activity. And the landowners that we work with range from, your granduncle Thomas, who owns 50 hectares of land, to huge pension funds. So you see the kind of gamut of the individual to the organization. And I would say overall their goals are often similar, but the way they go about achieving them certainly can be different. And obviously on the individual level, you have a lot more perhaps emotional decision making, which makes sense to all of us. Whereas like the more sophisticated and larger the organization, the more they may have frameworks and processes. I think in the broader like impact world, and obviously I'm very focused on carbon removal as one solution to the climate problem. I think the really hard part is for most people, regardless of if they're individuals or working in a corporation, they actually don't have enough information. So they're often end up making decisions, they just have to do it based on partial information. And so there might be something like, I once saw a headline that said, this one thing is really, like plastic straws, really bad, terrible thing. I'm going to stop using plastic straws. And that's the one thing they remember. And there's like probably 1,000 other decisions in your day that you make that frankly have a much bigger impact than the plastic straw. But none of our brains can keep all of them in the head at the same time. So I think one of the struggles along the whole way is there's not enough information to fully make decisions. And sometimes the incentives can be misleading. So in the plastic straw example, there was a huge campaign against it, and you kind of probably felt like you were a bit of I'm sorry for swearing, a bit of an asshole if you were, choosing to ignore that campaign and still use your plastic straw. And so someone coming around and saying, actually, you know what, guys, like if you think of the bigger picture, the straw is quite tiny, you probably would have been laughed out of the room. And so you had this social incentive of wanting to appear knowledgeable, do the right thing, and that pushed you to an action where I think if you had the full picture, maybe you would have been like, is this the absolute single biggest priority that we have in climate today? I'm not entirely sure about that.
Very interesting. And actually, maybe this Actually, my next question could be a bit controversial to our panel. That do we really need a good intentions? Because if there's a right incentives, maybe we don't have to talk about the good or bad anymore. Because sometimes people can do something good with some bad intention in the end. But do we think about only the result side? But how do we think about the intention side? Or do we have to take care too much on the good intention? Otherwise, the good intention can go totally wrong way at some point, maybe. And this is a bit tricky question, I know.
No, I think it's actually really simple. I don't think we can afford to only trust that the good intentions will solve the problems that we're facing. I don't think we are here because of bad intentions. I think we are here because our capitalistic system hasn't had the proper carrots and the sticks. So improving the intentions is not going to be enough. We need, I strongly believe that people do what they're incentivized to do. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't draw on our higher human skills and capabilities to listen to them when we choose our job, when we choose how to consume, when we choose where to fly. But I would still say that using science to then also maybe give a break to that person using that plastic straw, if that's now what that busy single mom needed to do to get her kids to eat or whatever, that bad conscience is not helping anyone, and looking at science, it doesn't make any sense. So we really need to understand what is big and what is not. And I think this is the part that has been missing from the sustainability discourse in the last 10 years or so, when it's been accelerating, and especially in the past 3 years or so. And what I'm a little bit worried is that by losing sight of what is big and what is not, we are wasting time that we don't really have. We are wasting, even more than time or money, we're wasting the capacity of leaders and decision makers to look at things that are just simply don't make the top 5 list. And we cannot afford to not fix the top 5 list. So that's why I'm the boring nerd who says, no, yes, we need the numbers, we need the incentives, we need the actual, taking your example of the fast food restaurant meal, look at the top 3 impacts. It's not the plastic straw. Everyone in this room knows it. If it's the standard, I'm going to assume the standard meal, it's the beef, it's the dairy product, and it's the whole logistics of the process. It's not the plastic straw. And just saying that actually outsourcing the problem to the consumer that will then drink his drink without the straw is just a really shitty way of trying to tick the box for sustainability. I guess we all agree now in 2023, but this was a big deal at least 2 years ago in Finland. I don't know how it was in Estonia or so.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I mean, I don't know about you all, but every 1st of January, I have the intention to go to the gym 5 times a week. I have this great intention. Does it materialize? No. And I often think a lot of sustainable behavior is the same way, that I honestly do believe that the vast majority of humans have really, really good intentions. You'd have to show me the person that you honestly believe is like, no, you know what, I love it. I want the planet to burn. Like, I don't care about the polar bears, let it burn. So I believe we all have really good intentions, and then what stops us from action is, the stuff that always stops us. Inertia, blockers in our way, not having enough information, not having the data points to know how to translate your intention into action. So I'm 100% in agreement on all of that. And I'm also in agreement that, ultimately, the reason why we need incentives in the system more broadly is also because it cannot be on the individual, right? An individual cannot make the 10,000 decisions on a daily basis. And so we need it like all the way down the value chain, starting with like capital providers, right? What are they incentivized to do? How does that impact the people to whom they provide capital, whether that's then funds or maybe even the companies themselves? And what are the public incentives they're facing, and then what are the unspoken ones? I think that's something when we were discussing this topic amongst the 3 of us, we were talking about how can, sometimes you have some incentives that are kind of under the surface, and maybe especially in the world of investments and funding, we can say that our goal is to hit 5 stars on our impact assessment, but we also probably have a goal of giving a return to our investors, right? And if we don't acknowledge that goal, we run the risk of those two incentives working counter to each other and the end result maybe not being as efficient as we wanted it to be. So I'm very much in the camp of let's just get it all out on the table. These are all the things that are impacting us, and then we can make the decisions better.
And I think there is often quite a deep lack of understanding of the other party's incentives in situations like that. If you're, for example, a green startup pitching to a VC, if you don't really understand what in the end of the day is how VCs make their money, how they bring the bread to the table, then it's very unlikely that you will be able to say the right things or do the right things. And the same applies, of course, then to each part of the value chain, or value chain, whatever, whole ecosystem, I guess, what you would call there. But I guess it's also one thing that is creating a lot of skewed incentives right now is time horizon. So what is really the payback time for your incentives? So looking right now through, so we get to work with a lot of really great European leading corporations that are, I've yet to meet a corporation that didn't actually want to, at least the people who are working on this topic, didn't actually want to do something about these things. The problem is that they are incentivized by very short-term things. There's a bunch of new regulation. I'm not going to bore you with the details. The ones of you who need to deal with this, you know what I'm talking about. But anyways, the regulations that are changing on a daily basis, not necessarily in a very user-friendly format, how they are being communicated. So you're basically just running this reporting machine easily. And you might be very frustrated at when the things that actually move the needle for your company's impact are things that the sustainability team cannot decide on their own. It's something that should be on the table of the executive team or even the board. It's fundamental questions of how this company makes money. Example, if you're now making your money with dairy products, what, if any, is your transition to plant-based? Or at least looking into the biggest impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, animal welfare and whatnot. So if you're not incentivized to look at this, but rather run these nice little green projects and report on them, it can be really unmotivating, and the incentives can be a bit skewed also inside companies.
Yep. Thanks. I think this time horizon issue is maybe in the financial world, it's called like a discount ratio. Similar investors have a similar discount ratio, so it's easy to kind of compare things. But maybe if I'm getting older, maybe my discount ratio is getting higher. So I don't simply say I don't care in the 5 years. If I'm becoming like a 65, because I have a grandfather-in-law who is becoming 105 years next month. So maybe he doesn't care about 10 years later. But maybe he do, maybe. I don't know. He does, I don't know. But maybe coming to back to your point, then this discount factor. But if we try to quantify the incentives, like we have if the incentive is almost like converted in the financial rewards or something or similar, this could be already easily discounted. Okay, then we don't have to pay much attention on this. Do you think we have to keep some incentives should be unquantified, or should we quantify every single incentive so that everyone can work on like a machine? This. Do you have any opinion on this quantification and non-quantification, or maybe?
I think Lisett, you had a good example. If you can mention that.
Yeah, and obviously on one hand, I'm a big believer in markets. I'm an economist by training, so I believe in quantification. But I also think, and maybe I'll give you an example. So in the landowner case, the very specific incentives that we give them is that they get carbon credits. So normally you plant a forest today and you wait 50 years for something, so you have a time horizon problem. With carbon credits, your cash flow comes 5 years in. But the question is, are there some activities where giving a very specific monetary incentive might actually make you lose the initial motivation that might have been more driven by some sort of ethic or moral consideration? And I've always there's this study that Kahneman and Tversky, who are behavioral economists, they did around childcare pickup. So there was a kindergarten in Israel, and they had a problem with parents being too late to pick up their children. And so they thought, okay, we're going to institute a fine. Every minute that you're late, you pay us 1 unit of money. And they thought what this is going to do is people are now going to start showing up on time, right? Because they don't want to be out of pocket with money. And on the contrary, what they found was that actually people started being late more because now this idea went from kind of in the moral ethical realm where like I don't want to be late because then my child's kindergarten teacher is late getting home and she has to wait for me and it's embarrassing and I don't want to be the bad person who does it, into a purely marketplace realm where it was like 1 minute being late costs this much. I have a very important call. I can afford the $20 or whatever it was, so I'm going to be late on purpose. And I do think this is a really important risk to highlight when we talk about putting incentives around behavior, because we do stand the risk of people's motivation changing. And I think especially in the impact world, we don't want that happening, right? It's important to us that they keep that good, positive, moral incentive that they had, moral kind of intention that they had. I think that doesn't mean that we never do marketplace incentives. On the contrary, if I believed that, I wouldn't be building Arbonics. But I do think it's important to keep in mind and be very specific and intentional about what kind of incentives do we use in what kind of situation.
So maybe then also, okay, thanks, Chris. This is very great example. So what something could be, but of course then if we rely on these values and morals, and then we need some another discussion because different culture could have different moral priorities. But maybe coming back to the Upright platform, I think you recently updated your model. Basically, all the impact measure is also quantified in dollars. What's the current feedback you receive from the investors or your client?
I'll come back to that. I went very shortly. I want to comment because I really love that example of the childcare, and I've been thinking that a lot about that. But wouldn't there be the problem is not so much the quantification, but rather that it's the wrong calculation. It's not the €5, but it's the 7 cries that my daughter has when she thinks she's not important, that I'm the one who's late and she's not picked up. So I think this really boils down to the actual difficult, inconvenient truth that we're facing right now as a capitalistic system is what to quantify. And that's the reason why, we measure crazy things in our model, not just CO2 and dollars, which is the easy part. That's what my colleagues don't give me shit about, sorry about my language, for making them explain to our customers. But we measure things like meaning and joy. What does science really know about the experiences of joy that classical music gives to people, or eating chocolate, or blah, 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 all of these things. We're not measuring them just to be like funny and nerdy and measure really weird things. It's because they are a part of the decision making that explain how the capitalistic system works. There is no way to explain why any one of you in the audience bought a chocolate bar if you only look at, financially, you lost $2, you didn't gain it. Environmentally, no, the environment did not need that cow farming or those emissions. Physical health-wise, no, it's not exactly good for you unless it was some super duper, not getting into the details of possibly some very healthy chocolate. But there was a reason. There was an impact category that basically led you to enjoy it, make you feel better, whatnot. So when it comes to quantification, I would like to remind us all that it's not just about for example, in this case, the fine was pretty bad. It obviously wasn't high enough because it gave the idea that it's just €10, which is €10 is fine compared to making my child feel the one who is not wanted or something like that, which is makes me shiver right now as a mom. So it's all about
maybe before answering to my question, maybe can I cut in? This is a very interesting point actually, because maybe quantification would be called maybe pricing. Then pricing can be decided by the market, the supply and demand, or maybe somebody can set some pricing for the time being. But do you think, I don't know, maybe we have to think about which way to price something. Sometimes somebody just set a rule, okay, this is the pricing we have to follow. Maybe this would work, but this will not continue. But sometimes we have to move to transition to the maybe market if there's enough demand and supply. But also that not necessarily the demand and supply could work perfectly. If you need some a perfect kind of information between the supplier and the buyer to have adequate pricing. But then
Well, I guess the same problem can be, I guess we've all done when the first wave of consumer compensation waved into, I don't know, depending a bit where you're from. I guess in Finland it was about 6 years ago when it became a big thing. And then a lot of my friends, we were debating that, okay, if I can buy a good consciousness for my flight for €10, is that really it? Then if you've been awake in your middle school math lessons, you can pretty fast do the math that this doesn't quite add up. I actually know a person who would then compensate for whole Finland's flights. Would that actually mean that those carbons would go away? No, the price was not wrong. The price was not right. And I know you are, Lisett, the actual expert on this. But these examples tell us that it's not just a matter of quantify or not. First of all, you need to quantify right. Second of all, you need to quantify the right thing. So it's not always the dollars for the extra daycare workers and their pay, but it's something else, and you need to be able to quantify that. It doesn't mean that you need to use it in the format of those numbers. And now maybe I can make the segue to your actual question. So you asked about what was the response when we added. So we run this Upright platform. We added about 4 weeks ago very concrete ways of when you're looking at the complex metric for that chocolate bar factory or whatnot. And there's the science behind the meaning and joy of chocolate and the taxes and the jobs and the emissions and the health and so on. Kind of like concrete metrics, both in dollars and in terms of concrete, like this and this many bars of chocolate worth of joy or so on. This was something we've been debating a long time, and I don't think this question is a very easy one on what is the right thing to do. Why we added this is to mainly bring a layer of concrete understanding to many people who are maybe not as obsessed and neurotic about this topic as I am and willing to think about the abstract math behind it. So just to give you some concreteness, but that's, I guess, coming back to these examples, it bears a lot of responsibility on what those numbers are. Because again, the same problem might be in there if you create an image that it's actually just worth those $10 or those 5 chocolate bars.
Yep, fully agree. And maybe a bit continuing further this pricing. So I think that you are mainly targeting the voluntary carbon market, and the voluntary carbon market pricing is basically depending on how the project are priced by the different supply and demand. Currently, I think that there's more maybe demand than the supplies. But what's your take on the development of this kind of the supply and demand situation in the coming years or so?
Yeah, I think carbon markets are an interesting sort of beast, and I like to compare them to maybe like the stock market 130 years ago when it was a little bit the Wild West, so it's very much still emerging. And I think you have a lot of dynamics. So on the demand side, we talked about some incentives being kind of non-monetary, maybe being like reputational pressure or the need to access better talent. And these are the kind of incentives that are driving up demand on the carbon market. For companies to be competitive, it's starting to become the default rule that you have to be making an effort on sustainability. On the supply side, I think what's interesting is, and you mentioned these like incredibly low price credits being sold, right? And so I think there's this like dual thing happening where you have some, frankly, probably nonsense things being sold that are most likely somewhat greenwashing-y, but they're extremely cheap. And cheap still flies today in the market. And then on the other end of the market, you have people trying to like actually remove carbon, but it costs so much more to actually remove carbon. So if we're talking like planting trees, we're talking 30, maybe 50 euros per ton. If we're doing technology-based carbon removals, literally sucking it out of the air, we're talking 200, maybe up to 2,000 per ton. And that's very different from those €2 things you can buy at the checkout when you're getting your next plane ticket, right? And so the supply side is really like going in those two directions. And I would say that it's significantly easier to scale the low end of the supply. So we need regulation to kind of take care of that, because otherwise it's going to be flooded with this low quality stuff that frankly I think neither functions as a good incentive nor is doing anybody any good, except just to mess things up. And scaling the really high quality supply is going to take time. And that will mean that the supply will be constrained for a long time to come, which will push up prices, which actually probably is good because price is an incentive, right? And if it's expensive for us to compensate, we might think twice about the action we're trying to compensate for.
I guess the net impact of what's been happening really might still be positive in terms of if we had started with the right prices, people would just have been like somehow just like frozen from the idea. And I think the similar applies to the mess that we're dealing with every day, which is basically like, let's just say this more short-term focus on, yay, we're reporting this much, and yay, we started these green projects, instead of looking at the core business and what's really going to happen. But I guess you have to ease the capitalistic system into the news, and the pace is really what you need to be responsible for. We don't have too much time to waste to just think that starting one cool project or compensating for that flight is going to save the world. It's not, I'm sorry. But at the same time, if we start with the too inconvenient truth, then it might just leave 80% of people totally frozen and not doing anything. So I guess this is the real playing ground where we are, and then it's just about accelerating that change, creating those incentives for companies to keep up, and really making sure that the more mechanisms we can build, that the ones who are the forward runners actually win, also financially, I mean, not just in reputation. That those are the ways to get the system to work.
Yeah, I think the capital market side and also it's right. Maybe the voluntary a carbon market is almost 130 years ago. It's a very starting emerging capital market. Maybe then they could catch up. Actually, it should catch up quickly and easier. Then maybe there could be fully integrated capital and carbon market in later. But yeah, thanks for that. That last part was very intriguing for me and hopefully intriguing to the people. But we have some last few minutes, so maybe could you just give some final message to, especially maybe to the potential founders, future founders? What could you recommend? Because we still need more good intentions, people to tackle on these climate issues. This is a huge issue, and we need more power, we need more talent, we need more capital. But do you have any final words, final message to the maybe future founders, founders here?
Future founders, I think that's really simple. Make sure that the core business that you're building has a net positive impact. Then the rest will be taken care of by the system.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would also say pick a very specific problem and set to solving that. You can't solve the entire thing. You can't solve for all of the impact in the world. Pick one problem, solve that really well, and you will have made a massive positive impact on the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisett. Thank you, Annu. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shinichi, and the wonderful panelists.